you have to be some sort of a...
Hey, Lugge! Det är för tidigt. Lugge, ta jag snart till.
Él es Peter Greenaway, director de películas como La panza del arquitecto, El cocinero, El ladrón, su esposa y su amante, o El libro de cabecera, entre muchas otras, pero quien también se ha destacado en otros campos del arte, en particular su trabajo multidisciplinario sobre pintura y música, sus grandes pasiones. Y estoy a punto de encontrarme con él para iniciar una conversación en el marco de la Cátedra Ingmar Bergman en la biblioteca del Museo Universitario de Arte Contemporáneo. Afable, se acerca hasta donde me encuentro. Si bien mi trayecto en la cinematografía ha explorado poco la ficción, creo que nuestras afinidades pueden encontrarse en el documental, sobre todo en mis trabajos sobre la creación artística. Su sentido del humor, ácido y a veces arrogante, se acompaña muy bien de una disposición sincera a conversar acerca de aquellos temas que están presentes en su enorme filmografía y creaciones plásticas y escénicas. La eterna agonía del cine, sus capacidades para crear atmósferas únicas, la conexión entre la pintura y la música, la relación con su equipo de trabajo en los rodajes y, desde luego, la experiencia de filmar su última película en México, Eisenstein en Guanajuato.
You say very often that the cinema is in agony or dying, but I think your movies are pretty much alive and love corpses, and especially I'm talking about Death of the Saint. I think it was for TV. What do you think about the agony of the cinema?
The agony of the cinema. I think cinema has been a great disappointment. Those extraordinary apologists, and most of them were either Belgian or French in probably, 1910, all imagined that cinema would be a glorious, magnificent dream machine equivalent to the enormous excitements of the human imagination. But I don't think it's worked out like that at all. I think cinema now is a rather tedious examination of bedtime stories for adults, and is very disappointing. Yeah. The possibilities still, I believe, are extraordinary, especially in the digital age. We can all have these superb, abundant technologies of a Picasso. Not necessarily we would have his talent, but the opportunities now are glorious, and I see very, very little indication of that glory being made manifest.
Going to the beginning of your career, how is your path, the creative path between the idea and the representation? How long or how difficult?
Well, I was in Milan, I think, about 6 months ago, and an Italian journalist asked me, Mr. Greenaway, you began your career as a painter. How is it you're now a filmmaker? And rather glibly, I gave him the answer that I was always very disappointed that paintings did not have soundtracks. So maybe that's what I do. I make paintings with soundtracks. And you notice that narrativity is not part of that issue at all.
I'm sure that you use the screen as a canvas and the camera and the lighting as a tool for painting.
Sure.
How is your relationship with your DPs or your art directors? How it works?
Well, again, I must be careful about arrogance and lèse-majesté here, but I am really the art director. Of course, I've got to use armies of people to manufacture things and shift the furniture around and have a good relationship with the DOP and lighting. But a lot of my movies, again, we made several years ago a film called Night Watching, and the inspiration, of course, was the chiaroscuro of Rembrandt. So you could say that Rembrandt was the art department head. But there again, we had to transfer and make that relative to the new medium of so-called cinema.
I remember the depth of the scene, the images remember me the anatomy lessons of Nicholas Tulp.
Sure.
No, that
Yeah.
sometimes it seems that you're watching the painting, not a film.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think I have to tell you. I think the evidence is in the cinema. My prime interest really is painting. I think cinema is very, very limited, and I think it's well on its way to its death now. But they're painting, I don't know, what's the earliest painting, cave paintings in the south of France, 45,000 years ago? I think they're redating them and pushing them back and back and back and back. But I suppose in terms of Western art, we would have to start maybe with Roman painting. I would say what has survived to Pompeii, what's that, AD 70, is really the beginnings, I suppose, of sophisticated Western representation as is described by the word painting. But again, maybe in general usage, I suppose you would probably take the beginnings of the Renaissance. But there has been an awful lot of painting, a huge amount of painting by massively different imaginations and notions of perception. But we've only had cinema for 120 years, 1895, 2015. I often feel very churlish about making the comparison. Painting has given us so much and will give us so much forever and forever. It's one of the classic art forms. But there is a way about, I think Bazin said this, didn't he, in 1936, that cinema is a combination of literature, the theatre, and if you're very lucky, some painting. I don't think cinema deserves the notion of being called a seventh art. It is not autonomous enough, and cinema knows that. That's why cinema always goes back to the bookshop, a tragedy.
I think sometimes that the heritage of the cinema comes from the opera. The opera used the same elements, the scenography, the script, the music, the lights.
The other interesting thing about opera, that round about, I suppose, few years after the invention of the cinema, it suddenly decided that the auditorium, which always used to be lit, should suddenly be dark. So the first dark auditoriums had to borrow the ideas from cinema to create a big switch, and that was probably responsible in some ways for the death of opera, because by 1918 it was really a moribund activity. But I think that the actual language of cinema, you're a professional movie looker, and you must know after you've seen 5 minutes of a new film, you know what's going to happen. Yeah. And cinema's very Christian, isn't it? It always starts with negativity and ends with a positive notion. If you're American, that means a happy ending. If you're European, probably doesn't mean a happy ending, but there's some sort of resolution. And we're so aware of that now that the opportunity for anything novel, new, to be reconsidered is extraordinarily, almost impossible. I read an article in Variety magazine, and Variety magazine is really the calling card for the Hollywood industry. And it said that only 5% of the world's population actually sees cinema in cinemas. That means 95% of the world is watching cinema in some other format, which is either television, DVDs, or smartphones. And they're probably watching this material on their own, in the comfort of their own home, where they can feed the cat and answer the doorbell, of course, which is good, but they're not seeing it in company. So at the very least, you can say, okay, we're in for an enormous change. I think what it really means is that cinema is really dead. I'm sure my great-grandchildren will say, Daddy, what was cinema? And they will not know the answer. It'll disappear. A supreme example of that is silent cinema. You probably look at silent cinema, but the only people who look at silent cinema now are children watching Buster Keaton on Christmas Eve, and one or two academics who are interested maybe in some archival question. Huge amounts of silent movies. Mind you, I don't think there ever was such a thing called a silent movie, and I suspect you agree with me. But, the rest of silent cinema will go the same way, and very rapidly.
I agree.
Cinema, I believe, have been disastrous for the last 50 years, and places like this, in fact, have held back the development of cinema. Just consider what you're about to do. In a minute, you're going to be in the dark. You are not nocturnal animals. What the fuck are you doing in the dark? Second, and this is a quotation from Godard, basically, you're all looking in one direction at a parallelogram of light, essentially. And that means that most of the world, at least 2/3 of the world, is behind your head. How satisfactory is that for a human experience? If you consider that the apogee of the cinematic art, in fact, is the feature film, most feature films now are about 120 minutes long, and you are basically obliged to be still for 120 minutes. You're not supposed to bother your neighbor. Nobody wears hats anymore, so that's not a problem. At least I don't think anybody wears. Nobody wearing a hat now that I can see. But sitting in the dark, looking in one direction with the world behind you, and I suppose remaining still, and I bet you weren't even still for 120 minutes in your beds last night, is an extraordinary preoccupation, isn't it? Isn't it most sort of anti-anatomy, anti the very business of being a human being? But we've been practicing it for an awful long time. There are evidences with, I suppose, the notion of very, very big screens, IMAX and Omnimax, taking, I suppose, its cue from abstract American expressionism, where in some senses the frame of the painting is so big it's beyond the edges, indeed, of your periphery of vision, that these things are beginning to change. There's also this extraordinary relationship of how you are all seated, and why do you need to be seated, on a rake in a proportion to a screen which is vertical. It does not have to be like this anymore. It's absolutely possible, and I'm sure you've seen many, many examples, for us to maybe project the imagery of the screen, indeed on the ceiling, on the floors, make it 360 degrees. We've had these ideas around for a long time, but there still is a way that they have not been implemented. And relevant to that, I'm always intrigued, and really this is the subject matter of this first clip, is the notion that the projection on a screen does not affect the screen. It may be said, perhaps, that when you put a theater play in a theater, it somehow affects the theater. But then again, the theater and certainly the opera house are three-dimensional activities, and maybe they don't have all the exact characteristics, certainly, that cinema does. And of course, if we change this sort of architecture, then there's every reason, indeed, we would need to make changes with the whole notion of what a cinema does. But let me actually make a demonstration of a notion of an expanded cinema, which no longer wants to concentrate on the singularity of a single frame. Let's just talk for one moment about the frame. The frame is a totally artificial proposition. I don't see you in a frame, and you don't see me in a frame. I've also, just like you, got a gyroscopic head. Never ever stand still. And I don't know whether you remember film going all the way back to Czechoslovakia in the 1950s, where drivers in cars driving along highways, their eyes were photographed, and it was absolutely amazing to see that the eyes were never, never, never still. The only time your eyes are still are when you are dead. So the combination of moving eyes and a moving gyroscopic head really does make the notion of the singularity of the frame really absurd. So there's one thing here I think we have to change and try and find an organization for the collapse, the breakage, the evaporation, the destruction of the frame. One of my ambitions then, if I can indeed continue to make cinema, is certainly to be very much concerned with the notions of multi-screen cinema, which certainly seems to satisfy my objections to the singularity of the frame and also offers you extraordinary opportunities for breaking down the architecture in places like this. Okay, about 5 years ago, the Design Museum in Milan offered me an opportunity to make, I suppose, a resume of Italian design, probably since 1945. It was indeed a celebration of Italian design. I wanted to be much more ambitious, and I wanted to take us away, essentially, from the ephemerality, shall we say, of domestic design, and do a much larger exposition of all Italian notions of representation, visual representation. So I suggested, why don't we do something much bigger? Why don't we start and cover the last 2,000 years, and indeed start with a painting in Pompeii and take us all the way up till now? But why is it that we have to play all the time with a parallelogram, a rectangle with 4 right angles? Why cannot we do something far more interesting? So we first of all wanted to not only have many screens, but to somehow cut and crop and organize those screens that themselves were no longer subject to this desire for 4 rectangles. Okay, here's a picture of a communist red adult of 35 living probably in Bologna, familiarly known as the Red City. You can see that we've made this diagram to show you a sense of scale. So the first elected screen is, as you can see, very, very big. And it's also shaped like 1/4 of a circle. Please try and imagine this as a 3-dimensional activity. Unfortunately, due to the limitations of this cinema, I can only show you things on a flat 2-dimensional screen. And the idea then that the actual shape, which is suggested, and the notion that it might be 1/4 of the planet Earth, is to suggest that's where all the wide shots, all the spectacular shots, all the overviews take place. Second screen is shaped rather eccentrically like a Roman triumphal arch. Are there any Italians in the audience? It's only the Italians, I think, who can invent the triumphal arch, with all its pomposity, its triumphalism, etc., etc. And of course, the rest of Europe has followed suit. So there's again a way, if we want to associate the content of your projection with the shape, I don't have to underline what should in fact be projected on that particular shape. We are, I think, probably still in an age of classicism, despite Libeskind, despite Gehry, who are determined to make our architecture organic and not classical anymore. And I certainly believe that the notion of certainly this room, and for the moment, indeed, this screen is offering us verticals and horizontals. I want to have the widest possible screen, again, to represent all the notions of panoramas. This is even bigger than the wide screens that appeared in cinemas in the 1950s and 1960s. And again, if you want to try and make fitness for purpose, surely it's absolutely the right shape for showing snakes. Here is the right shape for showing giraffes. Over and over again in the history of painting, of course, painters have fashioned their canvases to be somehow appropriate to the content that's portrayed on it. This particular shape, though ostensibly indeed still a rectangle on end, is torqued at the top to remind you not only of the fact that it is meant to be 3-dimensional, but also to have an indication that we don't have to stand still in association with this idea of you sitting there and watching a screen there. Okay, I have an awful lot to say, so I've given myself 3 footnote screens as well. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 screens. An awful lot of space to fill, and there are other things to be considered. It's now possible to change the transparency, the translucency, the opaqueness of a screen. We can attach them to an electric current, and on the fly, so to speak, as you actually watch the screens, you can completely keep changing their notion of translucency and opacity. There is a way that indeed the space is arranged such that you can wander. There are no seats here, and you can see screens within screens, and therefore you can see images within images. This is an idea, of course, that is intimated in all sorts of, I suppose, exhibition phenomenon around the world, but I've yet to see it actually in practice. I have prepared my first science fiction film to be portrayed on a space like this. Needless to say, I have no money whatsoever to do it. It's a dream. Here I'm going to show you, I suppose, which is really documentary in content. When you come to look at the subject matter, you will see indeed all the familiar sections of the way that art history is divided up in the last indeed 2,000 years. But there is a continual image that everything in this room, down to the socks on your feet, had to be designed by somebody. So there is a way I'm always wanting to remind you of the human figure. Not this little red silhouette, but figures in the flesh and blood. All right, let me show you what we did. Here we go. Okay, you can see the potential. This is one of the things we can certainly now, it's within our reach to be able to do. Multiple screening, multiple viewpoints, a immersive cinematic notion where we don't have to constrict ourselves anymore to the notion of the parallelogram, to try and find some dialogue between the notion of what you project on a screen has an effect on that screen and vice versa.
You work very close with great composers, and also you make tribute to some musicians like Philip Glass or John Cage. How it works, because the composers are so particular, no? They have their own ideas and they have their own methods.
Well, yes, I have to confess, I always ultimately fall out with composers. The ego clash is just too great. I fell out violently with Michael Nyman. We don't even talk to one another anymore. I fell out with Louis Andriessen, who is the Holland's avant-garde filmmaker. You might have heard of David Lang. I've just recently fallen out with him. And I even fell out with Philip Glass because we had lots of problems about meter and pace and time. I think it is to do with, indeed, ego clash. But I've always been fascinated by that relationship. If you've seen our latest film, you realize the music is by Prokofiev, and there was a profound relationship and between Eisenstein and Prokofiev. And you must remember, you must have seen all those black and white drawings that they both pored over for the very beginning of Alexander Nevsky, where Eisenstein said, I will not shoot a single frame of picture, and you will not make a single note of music until we've sorted this problem out. I think probably the results were apocryphal, and I don't really think those diagrams were followed. But certainly when I began my relationship with Michael Nyman, it was on a basis of that notion, to see if we could find an equality between the notion of the image maker and the sound maker. I think we succeeded in the draftsman's contract, but I don't think we ever succeeded ever again.
So I think the problem with them is that they don't understand correctly that the images need a special sound. It's not a personal request. It's the image that is dictated.
Well, I very rapidly realized never show a composer a script. It's the worst thing you can do because they immediately become illustrative. Illustrative music is not my sort of music at all.
But anyway, with all those problems, I think in your films the music has the rhythm of the camera or the movement. It's flowing with almost like if we're, with oil, everything. And like an engrenage that it's worked perfectly.
That's to do with editing. I'm trained as an editor, like Eisenstein. I am trained as an editor, and I'm absolutely convinced the editor is always, always, always the most important craftsman in the filmmaking business. There is a way that maybe 30 years ago the cameraman, the DOP, director of photography was in charge. It's not true anymore. I can do anything with his pictures whatsoever. I can change the color, I can grade it so he doesn't recognize it anymore, I can crop and change, and I can completely reformulate what he does. I still think he's necessary because I still need, as it were, the words and the commas and the punctuation, but it's the editor who now has total control.
You start with 16 millimeters and then 35 millimeters and then video. What about the formats?
Well, I've made IMAX and Omnimax films as well, so I really played with those postcard formats. I actually did make film on 9.5 once upon a time too. It was, I suppose, quite a self-conscious attempt to let's see what all these different formats and possibilities could give us. But unfortunately, we're now basically down to sort of television format, isn't it? At least in the 50s and the 60s, you could change, you could make a choice about your film ratio, but all that's, in one sense, the celluloid vocabulary disappeared. But what's so exciting about digital, of course, you can go right back to the beginning and you can choose any format whatsoever you so please, and that's very, very exciting.
Yes, I saw you at Eisenstein in Guanajuato doing a shot with a green screen and music and everything all at the same time. So you can see the results almost immediately.
It's extraordinary. You know, I was always so disappointed about celluloid cinema. You lost the film halfway through because it disappeared into the mighty black jaws of the laboratory, and it ceased to be hands-on. You didn't know what on earth was going on, and inevitably you were very surprised when it finally came out. And you know, however complicated or simple your opticals, they never ever worked out as you planned. So one of the great things, I suppose, the digital revolution is indeed, it's all hands-on, and you can see what's happening through the whole process, and that's very exciting. And you can continually make the most minute adjustments on the flow, so to speak.
So this knowledge that you have already with the new technologies that I saw some in Einstein in Guanajuato, it's the result of working with multimedia in your exhibitions.
Well, I think one of some of the great, values of all the digital revolution is we're now throwing away the categories. If you've seen Eisenstein, the latest film we've made, is it a documentary? Is it a feature film? Is there any difference? And you must know the funding situations of the Western world now demand, if you want to make a documentary, you have to write a script. And isn't that absolutely ridiculous? And I think if you see my last three films, you see I'm pursuing the notion of, shall we say, feature film as essay. Do you remember Swimming to Cambodia? Yeah. Do you remember My Dinner with Andre? It was the beginnings of feature film as essay. It rarely ever went anywhere, or people got scared and went back to the divisions of the fictional film or the documentary. But there's this great revival of documentary, I suppose, in the last 10 years. I live in Amsterdam, which hosts the most important documentary film festival probably in Europe, if not the world. There's a great recurrence, isn't there, in an interest of the documentary. I think the documentary is phony. I think the documentary is as fictional and as subjective as anything that exists in the feature world. So I would rather say to you, let me tell you lies, and that's the way I get at the truth. Don't let me dare tell you that I want to tell you the truth, because I'm bound to end up with lies. You know, even the word irritates me. Document suggests already text. We're not really talking about pictures at all in a conventional sense. You know, I was brought up in the educational department of the BFI, and Mr. Grierson was king, and I think we all know the unfortunate legacy he left behind.
Do you think the documentaries, you can make a real representation of the reality?
Well, you know, I recently, I've been doing, a lot of what could be conceived as reconstructed history, but I don't think history exists. History does not exist. The only way we can come to terms with it is through the so-called subjective imagination of historians. So let me rephrase that. There's no such thing as history, there's only historians. And most historians are liars. Julius Caesar, Winston Churchill, very good writers, but total liars. And every historian has a vested interest, so he's never going to tell you the truth.
Because each historian says his own story.
Absolutely.
Because we don't know nothing about the past.
Yeah.
Now we have some references.
What they say, history is only a branch of literature.
Yes.
And that's another tragedy there.
Yes.
I mean, we're talking about history being created by text masters, not by image masters. I know there are occasions when that's beginning now to open up.
We're talking about writing, and I'm absolutely sure that all your work have a personal architecture. So it's true?
Yes, it is. I think it would relate back to my desire, my wish, my ambition to be a painter again. I'm far happier talking about the aesthetics of painting history than I ever am about talking about cinema. It's much more confident ground, I think. And I also like the idea that painting, with the possible exception of Gilbert and George, is always a singular occupation, whereas filmmaking, very largely, is always a multiple gregarious activity, which ultimately, in the end, for lesser or for good, ends up as a compromise. And I think the very best activities are always about singularities and not compromises. You know, maybe the two worst things that happened in the 20th century was Soviet realism and Hollywood, because they're all about committee decisions and about notions of political entity and pushing the art form into areas it has no business going.
You wrote your scripts. And,
but you know what Godard said, you remember that. he said, unfortunately, we have created cinema that is text-based. And most people are visually illiterate, especially film producers. I cannot go to a film producer or a film studio with 4 paintings, 3 lithographs, and a book of drawings and say, give me the money. They won't know what the fuck I'm talking about. Do you know that the scripts I'm writing now are getting thicker and thicker and thicker, which is a big contradiction because I don't think I should write a script at all. But that is the way, you know, in mechanical terms, that we have organized how cinema should be made. I mean, with your knowledge, you must surely be able to tell me some films which you think were made without text, but it's very, very rare indeed. Even if that text is just a scribble. I would have said in the old days on the back of a cigarette packet, but we don't smoke anymore, do we? So on the back of a piece of paper, an envelope, let's say. You know, even Eisenstein, you know, even Godard, even all those people who seem to be free-flowing. You know, what's the name of that English filmmaker who makes movies without a script at all, which is an absolute complete lie? Yes. Well, not him so much. Who's the other guy? Very popular in France. Name I've forgotten, to my shame. I'll remember it in a minute. But the notion, again, of we have a script-based cinema, I think, is probably stamped in blood.
You have a special attraction for some filmmakers. Especially you made another tribute, for example, in 8.5 Women to Fellini. You know, that you have some filmmakers that is a kind of passion for them?
I think Fellini, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, is very, very uneven and has made some terrible films, but he's made some extraordinary films. And certainly I think Fellini 8.5 is an extraordinary film. I've often fought against the idea of making cinema about cinema, which might be ironic coming from my lips, but I often used to think it was in some ways incestuous, but I got over that problem now. And I really do. I think the last 4 or 5 movies we've made have started really to make movies about my grand heroes. I made an opera about Vermeer, I made a film about Rembrandt, and now, of course, I've made a film about my great cinematic hero, Eisenstein.
It's the first time that you made a film about a filmmaker. And Eisenstein is enormous, a huge figure. So did you enjoy it?
Enormously, enormously. I think one of the big problems was finding the ideal actor to play that part. I hope I can think that you would agree we found somebody who was very good. But there were so many necessities. He had to be 33. He had to look a bit like Eisenstein. There's so much evidence of what Eisenstein looked like. He was a very vain man and was always being photographed on the set and off the set. And I had to find somebody who could really convince us that he had an incredibly agile mind, that indeed he could speak 4 or 5 languages, and he was an extraordinary polyglot and knew a lot very authoritatively about a lot of things. But also he was desperately somehow mortal. And we've created, and of course the Russians are really antagonistic to me because they somehow feel that he's a grim-faced, you know, serious intellectual who would never laugh or smile. But you've only got glancing me to look at the evidence. He was an enormous center of attention. Women loved him. He was great social, affable joke teller. You know, he could go to the Sorbonne, and you can imagine the students in the Sorbonne being very, very severe, very, very Gallic, and he could make them laugh, and it wasn't even his own language. It's extraordinarily difficult to make people laugh telling a joke in a language which is not yours. And he had, I think, you know, enormous charisma. So to make him into a severe intellectual is not a good idea at all, but I don't know, I haven't been able so far to convince the Russian authorities. So I want to make him very, very mortal. He shits, he pees, he fucks, he vomits, he has mucus coming out of his nose, he behaves petulantly, he's a misogynist, he's naive, he misses the point, etc., etc. If I can make a dangerous analogy, Jesus Christ had to become very mortal in order to become a god.
The problem is that the history put monolithic figures, no? And when you put it that they cry and they made mistakes and they go to the bathroom and they humanize it. It's a way that you turn in a human and a static figure.
Yeah. When I do that in Holland, The Dutch, who are very practical people, think of Rembrandt as the car mechanic up the road, very good at his job, got a good, sensible wife who looks after the finance, will give you a good price, will bargain with you, and will produce a masterpiece. But when I go to Santa Maria del Grazia in Milan and are presented with Da Vinci, suddenly, you know, it's maestro this and maestro that, and people are genuflecting and bending over and kneeling on the floor. So the whole idea of Rembrandt the craftsman doesn't fit at all with Da Vinci the genius. I much prefer the Dutch model.
I love Bergman, but I love the piece that you do with the Last Supper. Did you went to the chapel? It's because it looks like the original.
Yes,
It's
we
not a
projected.
reproduction.
No, we projected on the original painting. That's always what I suggest. Must do. It's an absolute must characteristic. No reproductions, no facsimiles. We must have a dialogue with the author. It's extraordinary, amazing opportunity, an enormous privilege to be associated. Because the public have to see these paintings, we have to work at night, and I work with about 4 or 5 people, and you know, we photograph the painting inch by inch by inch and sew it all together by computer afterwards. We break down, I think in Rembrandt's The Night Watch, there are 7 million colors, and we identify every single one. And in English, there are only 50 names for colors, so soon you begin to lose the vocabulary. So you're just at the prey of the figures that are flickering through the computer, but that's very exciting. But to be able, you know, to sit night after night for 6 months, right up, cheek by jowl, by these extraordinary paintings, you really get to know them extremely well. And you really feel that almost, you know, here's another piece of arrogance, that you yourself actually manufactured them and painted them. There's a huge amount of mysticism, you know. Da Vinci's Last Supper, for example, is really about perspective and about gravitas. You know, it goes right to the heart of the Christian myth and it presents the sacred moment of the Last Supper. But it's associated again with all sorts of, you know, notions of mysticism. It's based on perspective, and the idea is that perspective should continue in the refectory where it's built. But the perspective should go out over Milan, all the way across Europe, and it predicates the actual site, would you believe this, of the Eiffel Tower. It crosses the Atlantic, and it predicates this arithmetical perspective of the Twin Towers. There's a suggestion that when you make a plan of all the objects on the tabletop, you know, all the plates and the knives and the bits of chicken and the lemon slices, you get a map of the solar system. These things are amazing. I don't know whether you remember the film very closely, but we isolated all the hands of all the apostles, and they're all figuring and pointing. You put all those hands together as a musical score, and you create the Song of Solomon, which was supposedly put in, was being played in Masada when the Romans destroyed the Jewish citizen. And it's actually inbuilt into Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and it's the essential music, which apparently was played in Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. Believe all that if you wish. Even if you don't believe it, you can see the amassing of mystical, supernatural association which clogs up our understanding of painting, and be amazed.
And then we had an opportunity to work on a painting by Veronese in Venice called The Marriage of Cana. Now, I rather suspect that you probably know the Marriage of Cana is a depiction of Christ's first miracle, whereby he turned the water into wine. I always think the story is a very, very badly disguised recounting, in fact, of the marriage of Christ. Let me show you, just to give you an idea, there was a way that every painting created its own strategy, and the Marriage of Cana, of course, is a Jewish wedding. And it has 126 characters in it, and paintings don't have soundtracks, but cinema certainly does. So I gave dialogue to all of these 126 people at this very famous wedding.
Listen to him. He will surprise you.
You were not surprised?
They have no wine.
It could have been anticipated an hour ago.
And even if they had wine, what is it to us? Know that my hour is not yet come. Pour the water now and take it in to the governor of the feast.
Water into wine? Wine into water? Who's thirsty for more miracles? Do we have a ghost at the feast?
Was it a trick? His father was a carpenter, made coffins, never out of work. Mother and son, with their company, on their way to the census office. They're after licenses.
Keep it in the family? Is magic hereditary?
They say he was unwilling to demonstrate his powers at such a public occasion. He was concerned people might think him a public trickster, a charlatan, a mountebank.
They might now have good reason.
I like it. No cloudiness. Completely clean. Almost a smart sparkle.
Tight edge. Maybe a little on the sweet side.
Certainly got body. Feels heavier than most.
How much left?
The colour is good. I can't believe the kitchens could be that lucky.
Should I drink it? Is it safe?
Where did they find him, this miracle worker?
Is it some trick of the Iron Throat? How did he do it? Wave a magic hand, put his fingers into the water? How can such a thing be possible? Did he drop in some pomegranate juice, some spirit of figs, duck's blood?
Hold it steady. It may very well be miracle stuff, but it will spill over just like any other wine.
There won't be any left. They are enjoying
I can
it
vouch
so
at
much.
last for a miracle in a public place.
If such an event were to be repeated every day, we would soon gather a multitude and a decent treasury.
And, no doubt, draw a great deal of unwelcome attention. We would be accused of showing off, exhibitionism.
A multitude is too small a number. In the end, we will gather the world.
Which other paintings you revisited?
Well, it became such a popular idea, and you could see why museums would be fascinating, because it's an educational tool. You know, we can explain 2 dimensions against 3 dimensions. We can talk about color coding. We can talk about the ideas of composition and so on. So we rapidly got a whole series of invitations. Come to my gallery. Come to the Uffizi. Come to Brera. Do it on Botticelli's. But it became, I didn't want to, continue the rest of my life doing this, because there are millions of really good paintings. So we decided on 9, and we are planning next year to do Velázquez Las Meninas, that extraordinary painting about reflections and sense of space. We've been invited by MoMA in New York to do a Jackson Pollock, completely different phenomenon. I've asked that we put the painting on the floor. You know, Jackson Pollock used to do all the stuff on the floor, so we want to recreate that. There's one of Monet's water lilies in the Tuileries Gardens. There's Seurat's painting in Chicago, La Grande Jatte, about the island of people in the Seine. And the prize, which I can hardly believe is true, and I almost feel, that I oughtn't to talk about it in case it's bad luck. But in 2019, they're going to refurbish the Sistine Chapel. We're not going to do the ceiling, but we hope to do Michelangelo's extraordinary painting of the Last Judgment. What do we do here? Well, we, in a curious way, we project the painting on the painting in order, deliberately, to have, I hope, an in-depth consideration for the laptop generation, as well as for all the art academics of the world, to suggest, you cannot have Jeff Koons without having Marcel Duchamp, and you can't have Marcel Duchamp without Picasso, and you can't have Picasso without Delacroix, and you can't have Delacroix without Poussin, and you can't have Poussin without Raphael. So before you know it, we're all the way back very, very quickly to Da Vinci. And most people, certainly the laptop generation, don't perceive that as a sense of continuity, and I think it's something that I feel beholden to do. And here's the opportunity to do it. It's very exciting.
Peter, thank you very much.